Okay, last time we left off, we were talking about how Emmanuel gave his farewell instructions to his disciples. And after that, so we'll pick up from that point. And this chapter is called The Falsifications of Emmanuel's Teachings. And at that point, after Emmanuel was picked up by the beam ship following his farewell instructions to his disciples, the UFO beam ship transported him to Damascus, Syria, where Emmanuel stayed for 2 years. Okay, this is what actually happened was when Emmanuel was finished giving his instructions, a beam ship landed nearby. Emmanuel entered into the beam ship. The beam ship took off and disappeared into the sky. That's the Christians call that the ascension into heaven. But we now know there's a much more natural and rational, logical explanation to that. In other words, the beam ship that I just told you about. Okay, after 2 years that Emmanuel spent in Syria, he sent a message to Galilee for some of his disciples to join him there before they began their journey east toward India. It was during this time that Saulus, otherwise known as Saul, followed the disciples to Damascus in an attempt to arrest them. And when Saul was on his way to Damascus, Emmanuel laid in wait. When Saul and his armed group came close, Emmanuel ignited a concoction of fireworks. The fireworks blinded and confused Saul. Saul was led into Damascus, where he met some of the disciples. The disciples taught Saul new teachings. Saul gradually accepted the teachings. However, Saul's consciousness was confused. Saul changed his name to Paul, left Damascus, and began to teach a confused, distorted version of Emmanuel's teachings. Excuse me. These confused and distorted teachings contributed to the false cult that later became known as the Christian religion. Even before Saul Paul's experience on the road to Damascus, but there was already a group of confused disciples in Israel who were falsifying Emmanuel's teachings. There were three main influences in that region that contributed to or caused the gross falsification of Emmanuel's teachings. Number one, Mithraism. Number two, Messianic Judaism. And number three, the Giza intelligences. Okay, number one, Mithraism. This was an ancient Babylonian false cult religion that had been spread into the Eastern Mediterranean region by the Persian Empire. The city of Tarsus on Eastern Mediterranean coast was Paul's hometown and a center of Mithraic learning. Mithraism was a type of pagan polytheistic false cult religion that promoted the belief in Godhead Trinity. At the head of Trinity was Kronos, the god of time. Kronos' wife was a quasi-goddess, earth-human mother, similar to Roman goddess Juno, and their son was Mithra, the god of light, born on December 24th. Mithra was seen as a redeemer god who had been procreated by Kronos in order to bring light into a world that had fallen into darkness. Mithraism was brought to Rome after the Eastern Mediterranean region became part of the Roman Empire. The two budding religions, Mithraism and Christianity, were very similar to each other. They competed with each other and co-opted each other during the first few centuries of the Roman Empire. Christianity eventually won out and became the official religion of the Roman Empire. So we can see that Mithraism was kind of what they call the Roman Persian version of Zoroastrianism. Okay, next one is Messianic Judaism. The ancient Jews also came under the influence of ancient Babylonian cult religion when they were forced into captivity during the exile period in Babylon, that is around 500 to 600 BC. The Jews, however, did not create a redeemer god. Rather, they invented something called the Messiah. The Messiah was patterned after Mithra. I'll have to qualify that because we can't really document that exactly because the Babylonian and Persian teachings were mostly oral in that time. They weren't well documented. But it's clear to me that whatever that was patterned after was very similar to what Mithra later became. So from there, we can say what was Mithra. Mithra was not a redeemer god, but rather was a type of superhero who would rescue the Jews from their oppression. When the Jews were released from their captivity, some of them brought this messianic influence back to Palestine. So the Messianic Jews were looking for a Messiah, and there were a few individuals who thought they were the Messiah. For example, Menahem, who was the founder of the Essenes cult. The Essenes were the authors of the Dead Sea Scrolls, also known as the Qumran records. The disciple Peter, who his original name was Petros, translated as Peter into English. Peter was heavily influenced by the Messianic Judaism, and he even promoted this idea in the presence of Emmanuel. But Emmanuel chastised Peter and warned his other disciples not to accept the confused teachings of Peter. Unfortunately, Peter and Paul eventually traveled to Rome, where they helped establish the first Christian church in Rome. The Catholic Christians even claim that Peter was the first pope, but Billy Meyer disputes this claim. Okay, next is the Giza intelligence, also known as the Baha, are a group of malicious and evil extraterrestrial humans who have a long history of falsifying the true teachings of the true prophets. And of course, this includes Emmanuel and even Billy Meyer. Here is a brief history of the Giza intelligence taken from a FIGU source. The origins of the Giza intelligence go back to a time when the civilizations that were the cities of Greater Atlantis, Lesser Atlantis, and Mu existed 1,300,000 BC. After an age of peace of 1,800 years duration, a group of power-hungry scientists attempted to wrest power over Earth humankind, but they were exiled from the planet when the people rose up against them. The scientists obtained possession of spaceships and fled into the space-time shifted regions of Beta Centauri. They returned to Earth 2,000 years later, filled with hate, led by Rs-1, the barbarian, and what follows was great bloodshed and war until 1,343 BC, when the descendants of Rs-1 at that time, who was named Arusam, also immensely evil, was exiled by his younger brothers, Ptah and Salaam. But again, the evil forces returned. This time, Arusam and his followers returned at an unknown year and set up their secret base beneath the Giza pyramids. Deep in the interior of the earth and deep below the pyramids, they established themselves securely, whereby they converted the rooms and constructions deep below the present pyramids of Giza as a center of their wicked purposes, from where they and their descendants since then tried to realize their tyrannical plans, but as of now without noteworthy success. Although their way of obtaining the goal of deceit, lying, and intrigues was by wrong teachings and the leading astray of the uncorrupted Earth humans through religious teachings and madness and cults, many kinds of other evil machinations. Okay, like a modern version of distortions of the true teachings was just talked about in the contact notes. There was a group of the Giza intelligence. There was a faction of the Giza intelligence who had originated on another planet, and they were religious fanatics, and they joined forces with the Giza intelligence, and they had this technology whereby they could amplify their fluidal energies and use it to attack Billy Meyer. And they did that, but Billy Meyer was easily able to neutralize those energies. But in the process of doing that, when he repulsed those energies, they lodged in his computer, and it caused all sorts of distortions and falsifications, and it made it hard for Billy to do his work. So that's an example of the modern distortions by the Giza intelligence, and of course the Plejaren ETs and some of their allies have been able to solve that problem to a large extent, although I think they're still ongoing. So now that's all the falsification. So since we're talking about the falsifications, maybe we ought to talk about what his actual teachings are. But we can't go into that; would take a lifetime. And if I say a few words about that, I'm going to use the modern teachings, in other words, the creation energy teachings, which And this mainly comes from the book Decalogue, Dodecalogue. Okay, I'm